Hello and welcome to the fifth installment of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire live events. We're so happy you have decided to join us this afternoon. And for those of you who are watching the replay, we are excited you have the opportunity to engage with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's programming. I do hope that you are all staying well, both physically and mentally, in these trying times, and are glad you are part of our global community. In the midst of this pandemic, community support is the only way we will come out of this crisis. For those of you who do not yet know, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to helping people better understand the challenges that are facing the world today. Of course, the coronavirus pandemic is one of the biggest stories of the day, but there are many other issues that have not disappeared just because the focus of the world is elsewhere. In fact, it is more important than ever that people understand these complex global issues so that governments cannot gloss them over. That is what the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is here for, and why we have committed to continuing to bring timely online programs to the global community. As a membership organization, the Council is supported by a generous community of global citizens. These programs are made possible by these members and donors, ensuring the Council's work can continue. We thank and appreciate everyone who assists the Council and hope that if you are not yet a member, you will consider joining or donating to help keep these programs alive. You can find out more information on our membership here on our website, or make a tax-deductible contribution to the organization by texting WACNH to 44-321. Your help is greatly appreciated. We would also like to thank our great sponsors who have made these past 5 events possible. Thank you to the John Bickford Foundation, Charles and Barbara Bickford, Stephen and Karen Barndollar, as well as Helen Taft and Peter Bowman. You are wonderful supporters, and we thank you for all you have done to make this series a success. In addition, we would like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all the support they have provided over the past 20 years. The Council is stronger for your assistance. Also, as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, the Council does not promote a political position, party, issue, or candidate. We are here to provide a platform for discussion and hope you will draw your own conclusions from the information presented. Therefore, the content of tonight's program contains the views of the speaker and do not necessarily represent those of the Council, its board of directors, staff, or sponsors. For those who it is their first time watching one of these events, welcome. We will be taking questions throughout the night, so please do send us your queries so we can have a full and robust discussion after Mr. Hart's presentation. You can send your questions to our email address at council@wacnh.org or send them to our social media accounts. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight, and someone who I recently found out grew up about an hour west of here in Keene, New Hampshire for high school. Mr. Tom Hart is the North American Executive Director of ONE and is responsible for ONE's advocacy, communications, and campaign activities in the United States and Canada. Tom leads a professional, bipartisan team dedicated to proposing and passing government policies to fight disease, hunger, and poverty, mostly in Africa. Previously, Tom was the Senior Director of Government Relations at ONE. In this role, Tom devised and executed ONE's government relations strategy for the US and Canada. Tom and his team led the way on unprecedented increases in development assistance by the United States, including historic increases in funding for HIV/AIDS, malaria, and TB through PREPFAR and the Global Fund, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and more. I would now like to invite Tom into the conversation. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be on. Should I take it away? Thanks so much. I want to really extend my thanks to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire for letting me bend your ears for a few minutes. It's a particular pleasure because I consider myself a New Hampshire kid. I went to Keene High School, and my mom and dad, who I think are listening in, are in Keene, as well as my sister. So I really love my roots in the Granite State, and it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to all of you about the global perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic and how it might manifest itself in the poorest countries. Maybe I'll just take a minute to say a word about the One campaign, my organization that I helped found about 17 years ago. So unlike most charities that you know, One is focused only on public policy advocacy. We don't dig wells or build schools. We promote public policies through government work, through foreign assistance and good public policies, both in rich countries and in developing countries, to ensure that the most vulnerable are supported. So we have offices in Washington, D.C., where I am today, also in Canada, Germany, France, the UK, in the European Commission, as well as increasingly across Africa, where we're doing advocacy toward African governments as well, for, again, to be focused on the most vulnerable. What I thought I'd do is walk through a couple of slides, well, perhaps more than a couple. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and then would love to engage in a conversation and answer some questions. I think what I'm going to do are three things: is go through first what we know about the situation with COVID-19 in the poorest countries, with a particular focus on Africa, which is our area of focus. Secondly, talk about what a global pandemic response plan looks like and some of the progress that has been made even in the short 2 months that since the pandemic hit. And then finally, what the wealthier countries like the US and others can do to help, and particularly how you and all of your listeners can help. So this slide might look familiar to some of you. It is the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker. It's being used by the New York Times and Washington Post and lots of other outlets. I recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. And it gives you a pretty clear look of how the pandemic has expressed itself across the planet at the moment. Obviously, with the largest known cases in the United States, represented by that largest circle, but obviously with Russia and across Western Europe, Middle East. You'll see down in South America a fairly large and growing crisis in Brazil. But if you look at Africa, it's quite modest. And indeed, as far as we know at the moment, the pandemic is hitting far less, at least so far, in Africa. So I want to talk about that. Here's a closer view of where the known cases are in Africa. The size of the bubbles are just increased so you can see them a little more easily. And you'll see that there are about 90,000 cases across the continent of Africa and 3,000 deaths. Again, quite modest compared to what you would expect given a continent of 1 billion people. Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco, those three large bubbles at the top, account for about 1/3 of the cases and deaths, and half of all the deaths reported so far, which again, I think is worth noting. So why might this be? There's a lot of speculation, and I want to be clear that I'm not going to give you data confirmed answers. Right now, we don't know exactly the reasons why the pandemic has not hit Africa as hard as we might have expected. But let me give you a few things that I'm reading a lot about and I've heard from experts. First is Africa is quite a young continent. So the average age in in Europe is 43. The average age in the US is 38. The average age in Africa is 20 years old. So it's the youngest continent in the world. And its relative youth, we think, is playing a role in lessening the severity of COVID-19. Secondly, and again, we aren't entirely sure whether temperature and humidity impact this virus, but if it's anything like the flu, it would. And it's very possibly a factor. Africa has just gone from its summer months, and now it is going into fall and winter. It's cooler months, because most of it is in the southern hemisphere. Just as we're getting warmer, and we hope that we'll get a bit of a reprieve, we think Africa might have had a bit of a reprieve so far, but of course that doesn't bode well as they move into their cooler and drier months. Also, There are clear societal differences. There's less travel across many places in Africa. You can see the travel patterns across North America and Europe and the Middle East and Asia. Obviously was the path that the virus took. People spend more time outdoors in open air homes, and schools often don't have walls, and so the wind is blowing into this more air circulation. And the elderly are often not clustered in nursing homes or elderly care facilities. They are taken care of at home with families, and so that may also be a factor. And then clearly a lack of testing. We're fairly certain, as we are in this country, that we are undercounting the number of cases, and frankly, probably undercounting the number of deaths. What is true in the United States is certainly true in Africa as well. But it's worth noting that there's an uncomfortable possibility here that Africa might just be handling this pandemic better than we are. As soon as the pandemic broke and was reported out of China, numerous African countries went into lockdown immediately before they had recorded even their first case of COVID-19. There's a bit of a dark side with that. Some of these crackdowns have turned to violence, and there's been police suppression of people gathering. And there's been some violence, but many of these lockdowns have been very effective. Another reason that African countries might be weathering this storm relatively better is, frankly, their tragic history with health problems. AIDS, TB, malaria, Ebola. They are very conscious of the impacts of global health crises, or public health crises, I should say. And they are really aware of the importance of tracking and keeping cases tracked and traced. There is an African CDC, Center for Disease Control, that was created after the Ebola outbreak. If any one of you who have traveled in Africa will see in the airports, your walls are covered in posters with health information. They have rapid response teams. They have testing in the airports. In the West, frankly, we have none of that, because if we get sick, we go to the hospital and we get taken care of. In Africa, for too many, you get sick and you've got a real problem. So there's a real public consciousness about public health. So even though the story at the moment looks slightly more optimistic, or I shouldn't say optimistic, looks less damaging than it is in other parts of the world, we are really worried about how the future looks. All these possible explanations for the relatively low burden at the moment mean that perhaps it's going to get much worse relatively soon. Again, there's almost no room for error. The health systems in Africa are already struggling to meet basic needs. The World Health Organization estimates that there are fewer than 2,000 ventilators across the entire continent of Africa. 10 countries in Africa have no ventilators at all. So as I mentioned before, if you get sick, the chances of dying from it are much higher. So we might see a relatively lower caseload and a higher death rate as this progresses. Another factor we're very worried about is proper hygiene. As we all know, we need to wash our hands, not touch our face, and all the rest. 1/3 of African homes have no clean water or soap for sanitation. And in social distancing, it's just not possible in many crowded cities or slums. So we're very concerned about how this will progress. While the continent is younger, there's certainly a high prevalence of pre-existing conditions: AIDS, TB, malaria, malnutrition, other diseases. And we know that people who are suffering from pre-existing conditions are more likely to have more severe consequences from the virus. Also, global disruption of supply chains of medical supplies, the shortage of PPE, including masks and gowns, is a real factor. And on the economic side, COVID-19 is going to be devastating. Sub-Saharan Africa will record its first recession in 25 years, with a growth forecast of -5% from when it has been growing by 2.5% to 5% over the last several years. There are 30 million jobs at risk, and 80 million people are likely to be driven into extreme poverty across the continent. African governments' budgets, never in terrific shape, to be frank, are also feeling the squeeze as tourism has gone down, import duties and commodity exports have dried up, taxes have dried up, and we estimate around $11 billion in additional health spending in order to contain the virus will put an additional strain on these budgets. And something we're watching really carefully is hunger. Many people earn just enough each day to buy their daily meal for themselves and their families. And if they're forced to be in lockdown, they don't work and therefore they don't eat. Millions of households will have a limited access to food due to the lower income. And there will also be disruptions to the domestic food supply and food hoarding by some. And all of this could reduce the access to food through higher prices. We're projecting that sub-Saharan Africa's agricultural production could decline by 7%, and food imports could be reduced by a quarter. So we're really concerned about not just the direct impacts of the virus, but the secondary impacts of hunger and economic distress. So given this looming threat to poor countries, what can we do about it? What does a global pandemic response look like? And it really falls into these three broad categories: an emergency response to protect the vulnerable. Secondly, we need to provide assistance to blunt the economic crisis. And finally, we need to take steps to ensure this never happens again, something people often refer to as global health security. Let me talk quickly through these three buckets. Protecting the vulnerable. This is about protecting essential workers, PPE, testing, tracing capacity, making treatment and eventually a vaccine available to everyone. It means supporting ongoing health interventions, because as I mentioned earlier, Africa suffers many challenges on the global public health front, including AIDS, TB, malaria. We need to make sure that kids continue to get their routine vaccines, even as we hope to develop and deploy a vaccine for COVID-19. Many more children will die of measles and rotavirus than they will of COVID-19, and we need to make sure that we don't disrupt those programs that are ongoing. One of the unfortunate realities we saw during the Ebola crisis in 2014 was a sharp rise in measles and in malaria because of the diversion of resources to fighting Ebola. Countries with donor help need social protection measures such as cash transfers, take-home rations and vouchers, converting schools into feeding centers to ensure people have the supplies they need. Now, cost estimates for this first bucket of protecting the vulnerable vary widely. Some have suggested as high as $100 billion, which is a lot of money. But to put that in perspective, and of course, we wouldn't expect the United States to provide all that $100 billion. Obviously, the poor countries themselves would provide the majority of it. But $100 billion is about 3% of the last supplemental the Congress passed. So again, it's all relative. That second bucket of economic support, creditors should provide immediate debt relief to poor countries. 30 countries in Africa spend more in debt service than in healthcare. And that includes bilateral debt, multilateral debt, and private sector debt, which I will speak more about in a couple minutes. The World Bank and IMF also need to get cash to poor countries' central banks for lending and grants for emergency food supplies and support for small businesses. And then once we're able to develop a vaccine, we're going to need to focus on that third bucket of ensuring this doesn't happen again. We need to monitor, test, trace, and treat. The African CDC is at the lead of this for the African continent. They need to help build stockpiles of supplies, vaccine production and distribution, and strengthening their basic health infrastructure. Now, many of you may have heard of PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was developed by President Bush, as well as the heroic work American workers in the military helped with Ebola. All of that has helped build African health infrastructure. In fact, countries that had the AIDS programs were far less prone to be struck with the ill effects of Ebola. We saw a direct correlation between countries that had robust AIDS programs with their ability to tackle Ebola. So we know that everything we do to help build infrastructure to fight COVID-19 will help protect Africa and eventually the United States from the next pandemic. So the progress in the last couple of months since the global pandemic hit, we've made progress, but we have a long way to go. In the economic bucket, that middle bucket, the biggest donors, called the G20, have agreed to suspend debt payments to the G20 for the rest of this year. And importantly, this included China, which is the largest bilateral donor to Africa. And it was a very big deal to have them included in this deal. It immediately relieved $12 billion so that African countries, instead of paying back their creditors, could use that for COVID response. This is really good progress, but there's more to do. there's not only debts to these G20 countries, but there are debts owed to private creditors as well as multilateral banks. And we need to make sure that they are also part of this deal. It didn't cover middle income countries, which, like in the case of some Latin America countries, are going to be in severe need of COVID-19 support. And it also was too short. It only covered this year's debt payments. And we know, of course, a vaccine won't be available probably well into next year. And this crisis economically will go for much longer. So we're looking to extend that relief through next year as well. So I've sort of just covered this. We're asking the World Bank and IMF and private creditors to step up with their own package of relief. One of the ways they can do that is the IMF has set up this fund. It's called a Catastrophic Containment and Relief Trust. Really rolls off the tongue, but it's designed. Donors are meant to give to this fund, and it will help give debt relief to the poorest countries for COVID response. And then, in terms of debt relief, long term, we need a real long-term solution to the debt problem, to restructure or cancel some of it over the long term, so they're not saddled with the debts that can't be paid back given the long-term economic impacts. Let's look at vaccines. So the world is in a race to develop, produce, and distribute a vaccine. And there are numerous tests and trials happening already. I'm sure many of you have read about them in the newspaper, including here in the US, which is probably leading that race. But also there's incredible progress in Germany and China and several other countries. Timing at the absolute earliest, well, from what I've read, is January, but much more likely to be spring or summer of next year. And that's just to produce a vaccine, find a formula that we know is safe. That doesn't count the literal billions that will have to be produced and then get into, be distributed among populations, every person on the planet, which is an unprecedented act for the world to try to organize. So far, major European donors have gathered a couple weeks ago for a pledging summit to raise money to develop and deploy a vaccine, as well as treatments to lessen the impact of the virus, therapeutics as they're called. According to the Wellcome Trust, one of the co-hosts of that summit, $5.5 billion was pledged. And this is good. It's a good start. $5.5 billion is nothing to be, nothing to sneeze at. But it is only scratching the surface of what it's going to take for the research and development and eventual production of a vaccine to inoculate everyone on the planet. Notably, the United States did not participate in this vaccine pledging conference, so that was a real absence. Looking ahead, the world faces some really thorny issues about how to distribute a limited supply of vaccine. There are questions about, do the wealthy countries keep the formula, or do they share it with the world? Do you hoard your supply to make sure that everyone in your country is vaccinated before you share it with other countries or sell it to other countries? Or does everyone have an agreement that you prioritize health care workers and the most vulnerable before you give it to healthier populations? These are really thorny issues that the world has not faced before. There's normally a lag of 7 years before poor countries gain access to vaccines after they're developed. We obviously hope that that is not the case this time. So as you can see on this slide, we're calling for bold investments in the research and development and supply of a vaccine. We want successful formulas to be shared as a public good. We want to find innovative ways to get the vaccine to poor settings. And we want to make sure that we avoid some scheme. We need to create some scheme to avoid the typical 7-year lag before vaccines make their way from the richest countries to the poorest countries. And as I mentioned, we're watching very carefully the food shortage situation. 419 million people could be pushed into poverty, coupled with massive job losses. And as I said before, if people aren't working, they aren't eating. David Beasley, he happens to be an American. He is the head of the UN World Food Program. He's predicted famines and food shortages, as he described it, of biblical proportions. So food shortages has the potential to create a security implication. As we saw in 2008 when there were similar food crises, people will riot and turn to violence to feed their kids. So we're very worried about what a long-term food shortage as a result of the economic impact and direct impacts of COVID-19 will have in the poorest countries. this picture that you'll see on the slide is a 2.5 mile long food line in South Africa. South Africa, one of the, it's a middle income country, one of the wealthiest on the continent of Africa. And people lined up for 2 miles just to get daily food. So we're looking to expand food assistance and social protection programs. We need to reduce the cost of remittances from rich countries to poor countries. Let me explain that for a second. One of the largest sources of incomes for poor countries are families working and living and working in Western countries, earning money and then sending some of that money home to poor countries, called remittances. Often that transfer of money across borders has a cost to it, whether it's Western Union or other forms of sending money. And it is one of the biggest costs, and it reduces the amount of support that families can give to one another. So there's a movement to reduce the cost of sending remittances home to 0% during this crisis. Another thing we want to do is create additional liquidity. This is just the ability of central banks in the poorest countries to lend and keep their financial systems flowing. And we're looking to the IMF to support that. We also want to facilitate access to food through lifting restrictions on grain and other imports. Progress so far. So in the United States, Congress has passed 3 major supplemental appropriation bills, so far totaling about $3 trillion. Just, I guess it was last week, end of last week, the House passed a 4th supplemental, equaling an additional $3 trillion. Out of all of these bills, the total funding for a global pandemic response has been $2 billion, and around half of that has been committed so far. So far, it's been very, very small, and understandably, the response in the United States has had to be focused on the United States. We're very much hoping that this next supplemental will have a bit more investment in the global response. So we're advocating, along with our key partners in the development community, for a far larger investment in the global response in this 4th supplemental appropriation. And it would include these 4 parts: global health response, including support for frontline workers, water and sanitation, support for core health investments like AIDS, TB, malaria. Also, refugees and migrants and vulnerable populations in areas of conflict needs particular support. Third, economic relief, including food security, livelihoods, local market support, basic education, peace and stability programs. USAID, our main development agency, runs lots of programs to provide economic stability and support, and we want to give them a leg up given this crisis. And then finally, there's, in this package of assistance that we're promoting, is support for State Department operations and USAID operations, supporting Americans who are working with these developing countries all over the world. Very unfortunately, the House of Representatives provided exactly $0 for a global response in their bill. So now we're in the situation of turning to the Senate for support. The Republicans have the majority. It has been, these issues of foreign assistance and some of the programs that I've talked about during the session have earned and had for a long time bipartisan support, particularly from the Senate. And we're going to have to be leaning on that support yet again. So we're in the fight of our lives to get some support for a global response in the next supplemental appropriations bill. So let me conclude just a couple of words about what you can do if you're interested. Please share this talk with others. I know there'll be a recording and we'd love to help spread the word. We could use your help, frankly, in urging your senators to support a robust global pandemic response. If you're interested in joining us immediately, you can text that number up on the screen, 40649, and putting the word One World, which is all one word, in the message. And then you'll be joined up with what One is doing. And if you want to join our amazing volunteers, including Susan Pillsbury, who you see there just to the left of Senator Warren in that picture, and is an incredible volunteer, advocate, and organizer for us in New Hampshire. If you're interested in joining, you can just go to mobilize@one.org. So I've spoken longer than I expected, and I really am very grateful once again to Tim and the World Affairs Council, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tom. As you can all see, we are taking questions at this point. So please do send them along to our email address, council@wacnh.org, or on Twitter or Facebook. We can take them there as well. So we have a number of questions coming in. We are going to start off with one here. Once coronavirus is under control in Africa, what is needed to ensure it does not rebound and start a new round of infection around the world?
It's a great question. So this is that third bucket of global health security, where we need to bolster institutions like the African CDC, which tracks and monitors the health situation to make sure that any outbreak is quickly snuffed out, and that that cases are traced and then people are treated. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we're dealing with a virus that was very, very sneaky. People apparently have had it and don't even show any symptoms, and then it spread very easily through the air, much of which we did not know until very recently. So what we need to do is bolster those healthcare systems and that sort of tracing, tracking, testing capacity in Africa to ensure that any new viruses that are discovered are snuffed out quickly at the source.
Okay. A follow-up to that, given the vast differences in governments in Africa, how would an organization plan for these interventions for the most vulnerable?
It's a great question. Yeah, there are 54 different African countries and different histories and different capacities to handle this. So, well, the United States, how do I put this? In the way the United States often work together on big problems, although I'm not sure we're doing that at the moment, but the countries of Africa work together on lots of things. And the African Union is a very, very strong coordination mechanism. The African CDC sits at the African Union and provides an incredibly important coordination role, both in terms of putting out information, setting standards, and tracking accountability from all these different countries. There's a really strong spirit of collaboration among the African nations, and I think that that's going to be the best way to tackle and overcome some of those differences. There also is just enormous travel, and people, they grew up in Somalia and they've got family in Kenya, and they work in South Africa. So it is not unlike the United States, and where you might have family all over the country, and it feels quite natural to get on a plane or get in a car and go somewhere. So it does have that same feel there.
Okay. We have a question here. How might the focus of resources on fighting COVID-19 in Africa affect the fight against or reemergence of other diseases on the continent? I know you touched a little bit on this, but I think a little bit more.
Yeah, it's about building that healthcare capacity and tracing and testing. It is about, well, let me answer your question by pointing out what did happen. South Africa has 30,000 healthcare workers going to test people throughout South Africa. Some of that was created as a result of the Ebola outbreak. That's the same in several other countries. The Ebola outbreak kickstarted a series of systems and information networks and trained physicians and techniques that they are using now. That we think that's one of the reasons they are managing this virus perhaps better than expected. So everything that we do in Africa, and frankly, we're going to need to do it in the United States too. Everything that we're learning now, we're going to have to double down on in order to be able to tackle the next one.
All right. Just a reminder for people who are looking to send in your questions, we are still taking them at council@wacnh.org or on Twitter and Facebook. So our next question comes from one of our newest members here at the council, Susan von Hemert, is asking, as a healthcare worker, what can we do to assist the global PPE deficiency? And for those who may not have heard this acronym, PPE, personal protective equipment.
Yeah, this is the masks and the gowns and the face masks and all the protective equipment that our healthcare workers so desperately need. So I'm afraid, Susan, I don't have a very good answer to your question. To be honest, at the moment, what I'm hearing is there continues to be needs in this country, which, if there are ways we can support that, we should. I have not heard about a crisis of PPE in Africa yet. What I do know is that with their head start, they are stockpiling PPE, and from what I've heard, and again, I want to emphasize that sometimes information is not perfectly clear, but that they are not looking at a PPE crisis in Africa at the moment.
All right, we have a couple of questions here on WHO. How will the U.S. administration's slashing of the World Health Organization's funding and threat to do so permanently affect the coronavirus response in Africa?
So this is obviously deeply disappointing that in the middle of the fire, we're kicking the ladder out from one of the firemen. The WHO is not a perfect institution. Certainly an after-action evaluation needs to happen. In fact, the World Health Assembly, the governing body of the WHO, just passed a resolution overwhelmingly agreeing that such a review needs to happen. But it is very damaging. The potential cut from the United States, the WHO's largest donor. The WHO provides invaluable guidance and technical support all across Africa. They provide enormous support to the African CDC and to health ministries across the continent. So the impact of this potential cut could be severe. What we've seen maybe is good news is that other countries have stepped up to fill the vacuum that the United States has created. As a proud American, I'm disappointed that the United States is stepping away from that global leadership. But in terms of, from an African perspective, the WHO hopefully will be able to provide most, if not all, of the support that it was planning to for the most vulnerable countries there.
Okay, and our next question on the WHO. What are your thoughts on the work of the World Health Organization, and should an investigation of their response to the coronavirus be held now or after the pandemic is under control? I know there's a lot of debate going on around the world on that topic.
I mean, look, I think logically it should happen after the crisis is under control. I think it also, just as logically, there should be a rigorous after-action review of what happened. It seems pretty clear that it has not gone perfectly. The WHO is not a perfect institution, but the cost of undermining it now and distracting ourselves from fighting the virus is too high. Viruses love it when we get distracted and start fighting with ourselves, but we need to keep focused on fighting the virus, not each other. And so we need to wait till we can get this under control. We got to put the fire out first.
All right. Last question for now on WHO. What are your thoughts on the recent expulsion of WHO workers from Burundi?
I apologize. I don't know. That is not a case that I'm familiar with. I
think they're referring to the case in which the government of Burundi has made the chief of the WHO in Burundi a persona non grata in their country after he made some comments about the election moving forward with many large rallies that the president was hosting, and that this was not obviously a great idea around the social distancing issues and things of that nature. So I think it just recently happened. I just saw an article about it a few days ago. But yeah, interesting, but not entirely surprising that some people are not exactly happy, particularly around election time, for those kind of actions. So, all right, we will move on to our next one. Given the isolationism movement in many developed countries, as well as rising authoritarianism around the world, how realistic do you believe it is that these countries that usually act as global aid leaders will do so if Africa's pandemic expands?
Well, we were really encouraged at the European Vaccine Summit that I mentioned at the top. Sorry, that was a half an hour ago, so my apologies if you don't remember. About 2 weeks ago, the European Commission hosted a summit, a pledging summit on vaccines, and every leader, there may have been 20 or 30 heads of state who spoke, and each one of them committed to providing a vaccine in an equitable manner. So we were really encouraged by the show of solidarity and the acknowledgement that everyone on the planet is going to need access to this vaccine once it's developed. As I mentioned, noted in its absence was the United States and Russia. And given that the United States is likely to be one of the leading countries to lead the conclusion to developing a successful vaccine, it's a real concern about how we will handle that vaccine. And look, these are complicated ethical questions about who should get it first, how is it distributed, intellectual property rights. You know, we know that these companies who are developing them need to make money in order to support their own research. So I don't pretend to suggest that these are simple questions, but we are going to be facing them sooner than we'd like, because soon there'll be, you know, some vaccines, and we're going to need to figure out how to get it out to everyone in the world.
All right, just entering in one question we got on Twitter here. What is the top issue that African leaders face in combating the virus? Is it lack of testing, healthcare systems? What are we looking at?
Well, I'm not sure which they would say is the top. Testing is clearly a problem, as it is here and in Western Europe and other places. No one is doing enough testing, so we are underestimating the impact of the virus at the moment. But I do think, I would say healthcare system strengthening. As I mentioned in my remarks, the challenge in Africa is, while it is generally younger and at the moment they've taken really good and sort of productive action against the virus, when people get it, more people will die because their healthcare systems are so weak. They don't have ventilators, they don't have ICU beds, they don't have enough doctors and nurses to support a mass influx of new patients. So healthcare system strengthening is absolutely critical to any response.
Okay, just looking through here, making sure I haven't missed anyone's questions. Got all of those. All right, so I've got a question for you. In terms of what people can do, I know you mentioned helping with the advocacy and reaching out to One World, but what are some areas in the local communities that people might be able to help out with some of your work? I know you guys have a great nationwide network of local communities who help with you. Can you talk a little bit more about how those are structured?
Yeah, sure. We have an incredible field operation in every state in the country, including New Hampshire. We have paid staff who manage regions, and then volunteer organizers like Susan Pillsbury, who I mentioned on that last slide, our fantastic organizer in New Hampshire. And those volunteers gather networks of other volunteers to first learn about the issues, get themselves educated, and then mobilize to talk to their congressional representatives and other policymakers to support more assistance and better assistance to tackle these sorts of challenges. So it's, I should say, we are completely bipartisan. Everything that we have, all the policies that we support are supported by politicians on both sides. We know that's incredibly important in order to gather the most number of people, but it's also the only way to get things done in Washington. So we don't believe that these issues is the domain of any one party. And at the moment, frankly, we're going to be looking to Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to provide the global pandemic response that we didn't get in the House bill, disappointingly. So we'd encourage you to join us. We try to make it easy by breaking down these complicated issues into small bite-sized pieces of work. We try to make it easy to contact your members of Congress with phone numbers and addresses. And of course, now we're all digital, so all this is happening virtually, but in normal times, we gather people in Starbucks and at concerts and sign people up and do trainings, and it's a great network of people, both young and old.
Okay, our next question comes from Stuart Johnson, who's a student at the American University in Paris. Can you address the role that disinformation has played in African nations' ability to fight the virus?
It's a great question, very relevant, not just to Africa, I might say. Disinformation is proving to be a real hurdle. I can't specifically answer your question of how, what is the impact exactly. We will only be able to measure that once we get through this and have better data. But it's clearly a problem. There are lots of conspiracy theories, misinformation about the virus, some denial of the virus. There is vaccine hesitancy in Africa, as there is in some parts of the United States and Western countries. So there's no doubt that that disinformation is going to play a factor and going to be an additional challenge to the already Herculean challenge of getting a vaccine to everyone in the poorest parts of the world.
Okay, great. Our next question we have, do you think the coronavirus pandemic will lead to even more isolationism and a retraction of globalization worldwide, even when the large threat of it has passed?
It's such a good question, and I'm struggling to answer it. I really think it could go either way. Lock our borders, keep people from coming in, keep the virus out. It makes sense. That makes sense to me. We also have just had a crash course in how connected we are globally. I've spent most of my career in Washington trying to talk to politicians about why global health matters. This nasty little virus has just made the case for me. No politician I talk to wonders why I'm coming to talk about the importance of supporting global health, whether it's Ebola or HIV/AIDS or now COVID-19. So I guess I wake up every morning an optimist. So I believe that this will teach the world about how interconnected we are and the importance of collaboration. We might well get the vaccine from Germany or some other multinational collaboration. And boy, are we ever not going to want to shut our doors. We're going to want to be collaborating. So the other thing is, and this doesn't have to do with COVID-19, but just how interconnected we are. 95% of the markets that our big companies sell to are outside of America. 95%. So if we close our doors, it not only would isolate us from potential therapeutics and vaccine on COVID-19, but the economic impacts of closing our doors would be pretty devastating too.
Yeah, and I'll add two things to that. First, to your comment about, we may be getting the vaccine from some other country. Moderna, which I believe is a Spanish company, is they've had some pretty good success with their first the trials of their vaccine. And just to show the interconnectedness, they have a partner organization in Portsmouth over at Pease Trade Center that may actually end up producing that vaccine.
Oh, wow.
So nice little connection there. And then in terms of this question in particular, if you are interested in learning more about it, we did talk with Dr. Bruce Elmsley on our Global in the Granite State podcast this past month to talk about the global economy and its interconnectedness. He talks that, there may be a pullback to start and people may change their production methods and things of that nature, but long term, he thinks globalization is here to stay. All right, so our next question comes in. If the One campaign had unlimited funds,
ooh, I like this question
that'd be
already.
great for all of us. What steps would they be taking to tackle these issues?
Well, if we had unlimited funds, we would buy the formula for the vaccine and give it to everybody as quickly as possible. If we were talking about just our advocacy, that's a great question. I think we really would continue to build the case and do much more public education in America and in other donor countries about this question we were just discussing of our interconnectedness. The fact is, we're not going to be able to protect ourselves here in the United States unless we tackle this everywhere. Even if we build the wall and the protective bubble around the United States, if this fire is raging in Africa, those embers are going to come back across. So I think it would be I would put my money on, talking with the American public, who then talk to their representatives to make decisions that really do recognize the interconnectedness that we're experiencing.
All right, our next question comes from Alex Gordon, who I believe is down in Florida, mentioning that she'll be talking with the office of Senator Marco Rubio a little earlier.
All
Seems
right.
that we can learn a lot from Gobby regarding dispensing the vaccine. What do you think? And can you talk a little bit about who and what Gobby is for those who might not know?
Yeah, Gobby is it is a multilateral institution. It's a partnership of pharmaceutical companies and foundations and governments. It's a Geneva-based foundation, and what it does, it's just an amazing organization. It used to be an acronym, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, now, like the AARP. Now they're just the acronym, so people call them the Vaccine Alliance. And what they do is they create a market for vaccines that wouldn't otherwise exist. Let me explain. So Johnson & Johnson has a vaccine for whatever. It's frankly, as a commercial issue, not worth selling to Mozambique. Mozambique is too poor, has too few people for Johnson & Johnson to bother. And especially that vaccine or that therapeutic might be much, much too expensive for a poor country like Mozambique. So what Mozambique does through Gobby joins and pools the market of 10 countries and says, okay, Johnson & Johnson, we just created a market for this with 500 million people now. Will you be willing to lower that price to a price point where we as Gobby will buy it and then distribute it? And then Johnson & Johnson says, great, that makes sense to me. So Gobby is this really innovative public-private partnership that pools funding and shapes the market to distribute vaccines that wouldn't otherwise be distributed. Gobby's core mission is to prevent childhood deaths. So measles, diphtheria, and what are the other ones? Rotavirus, the leading killers of kids across the poorest countries. So their day on and day on job is to save children's lives through a regular course of immunization. And they do this extremely well. They've been up and running for 15, 16 years. It's clear that Gobby is going to play an essential role in the distribution of COVID-19 vaccine when it becomes available, both to kids and adults in the poorest countries. Someone at Gobby said to me just the other day, they are preparing to vaccinate half of the world's population, which is quite an astonishing thing to imagine. But look, in this crisis, we're not going to create some new institution, nor should we. Gobby does incredibly important work in terms of getting vaccines to people. So they are a key partner in all this.
All right, our next question, I think we've got time for a few more here. So again, if you have any questions, do send them along to our social media or our website or our email at council@wacnh.org. So what other issues is the One campaign working on? How have you had to switch your tactics because of this crisis?
So when the crisis hit, we put a pause on everything we were doing and really took stock and pivoted 90% of our work over to a response to COVID-19, which was a tough decision. We'd spent a long time and we're really thoughtful about what our plans for 2020 and 2021 were going to be, which were actually, there was some synergy there. We were working on Gobby, and it has every 5 years it has a big pledging conference, and it's coming up in June. So we were working on that. That's as relevant as it's ever been. But there are some things that we were working on, some other fundraising efforts and advocacy campaigns on different subjects that we've really said, you know what, we're going to have to take a pause and work on COVID-19. And it's been really satisfying. I mean, I helped get the organization One campaign started, and global health has always been at the heart of what we've worked on. And so this felt natural. Also, the scale of the challenge here with COVID-19 requires the scale that only governments can bring. We at the One campaign know that government advocacy is not the only answer to fighting poverty abroad. Charity, charitable contributions from individuals, churches, philanthropists, businesses, everyone has a role to play. The part that we like to work on is obviously governments, because governments can bring a scale that the others can't. And when everyone on the planet is vulnerable to this vicious little virus, we knew that governments had to step up and step up big, and therefore our advocacy would matter. So we're excited, even though it's proving to be incredibly challenging. So far, we haven't had all the successes that we want, but we're not going to give up till it's done.
All right. So you mentioned that Africa has a high population of young people, one of the highest in the world, with reports of unidentified syndromes affecting younger people who are believed to have had the coronavirus. Are there any fears on how these could affect younger populations in Africa?
So yes, the quick answer is there are real concerns with that. I think scientists and doctors are just discovering what these, sort of severe inflammation that many children are suffering from and some dying from. That is a real concern. I have not heard reports of that out of Africa yet. It's a great question, actually, and I'm going to go look at that after we conclude. But yeah, for sure, it's a concern.
Okay. So for a final question, I think this is a good one to end on. What is a silver lining or benefit that the world may take from this pandemic? Some type of positive note to think of for when we're past this. Always good to end on a good note.
I think it's a great one, although there are days when I'm not sure that I can see a silver lining. No, I really do think, as I mentioned earlier, this terrible virus has given the world a crash course in how interconnected we are. And frankly, the commonality of humanity, the divisions of, across borders, and obviously the most vulnerable are hit hardest, but we're all vulnerable to this. And it gives the ability to say, oh, that's not just a problem over there. It's a problem right here in my own community. And I'll admit my own family and myself are sometimes anxious about this. And while that's not necessarily the most positive, I do think it helps connect us. We've seen incredible acts of heroism and compassion and generosity. And I really do think, unfortunately, it takes crises to sometimes see that. And look, I work in Washington, an incredibly polarized city. This is breaking down some walls. Not perfect, but it is breaking down some walls. And so I hope that out of this crisis, people can keep some of those walls down.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I think certainly it has shown the resiliency of the world and our own little communities as well. I mean, the pivots that people have made to re-envision the work that they're doing, like the One campaign, focusing so much on the coronavirus pandemic now after having so many other areas of focus that you had been working on and planning for. I think it's so amazing that we all have this opportunity to re-envision what we're doing and try and build these bridges that will help make us become stronger as we come out of this crisis. So I want to thank you, Tom, for joining us today and giving us a little bit of background about what the One campaign is doing, particularly around the COVID-19 pandemic response. I think this was a great opportunity for people to learn about what they can do to help with this. So thank you so much for giving us your time and for your insights into this crisis. I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. We really appreciate it. Our next event is going to be with Martin Nicola. He will be joining us from the Czech Republic, where he lives, and we'll be talking about rising authoritarianism in the heart of Europe. That will be on June 3rd, so 2 weeks from now. We do hope that you'll join us there, as well as consider becoming a member of the organization. You can join on our website. You're there already. Hopefully, just click over to membership and do consider joining this great organization. It is through your support that events like this can continue to happen. And we really appreciate everyone who is able to help the organization in our efforts to make people better understand these complex global issues. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. There is warmer weather coming to New Hampshire, which is great news. We really appreciate it. And we will see you in a couple weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim.